Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased with such a distinguished panel of really great representatives from their countries. So we have now 55 minutes together discussing the geopolitical situation. As you know, we are truly living in a multi-conceptual world and a multipolar world. Multipolar with a lot of different actors that are asserting themselves and are using what is perceived as different vacuums. And multi-conceptual, as we all know, we in the late 90s, post the Cold War, we thought there was one ideology, one way of running the world, but I think we are now faced with multi-conceptual ways of looking at the world. On top of this, we have slowing global growth. We have inequalities that have to be also addressed. We have looming trade wars. Climate change and environmental challenges also pressing. Each of these challenges would in itself be daunting tasks, but they're so interconnected, and they are also based on the interconnectivity. We also see that to deal with them, we have to do it holistic, but we also need cooperation. How can you deal with climate change, for example, on a national level, or trade in global value chains is there? These are challenges that the panel will then answer and address. We have Foreign Minister of Canada, the famous Chrystia Freeland here on my left. We have known each other for some time, and we also done trade negotiations together, but we are on the same team.
Yeah, Børge and I have a history of WTO teamwork, so
we have
a week in Nairobi is a really bonding experience.
It is, and no sleep. We have Foreign Minister of Japan, Taro, welcome. We have the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea, Madam Kang. We have the Minister for Finance of Singapore, Mr. Heng. And we have Professor David Gergen, Director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. I think we should welcome them with a big applause. Chrystia, why don't we start with you? When we met in Davos a year ago, the big question was there going to be a NAFTA deal or not? You reached an agreement, Mexico, Canada, and the US. Since then, you have had other challenges, mentioning China, Saudi Arabia. You are really in the middle of this multipolar world. But Canada also is a country that is a strong believer in the multilateralism. How can we make ownership to multilateralism, to the UN, and those values that Canada holds so high? How can we secure these values in a smart way moving forward? But I think we have to do it differently than we've done in the last years.
Yeah, I very much agree with that, Børge, and thank you for the very kind introduction and for the great work you've been doing here at the forum. Look, I agree with everything you said in the introduction, and I think we need to be honest with ourselves and with each other and say, as you've said, that the rules-based international order today is facing greater challenges than it has at any time since the Second World War, at any time since it was created. And that's very serious. You know, I sometimes scare myself when I say that. But I also think that we are starting to figure out how to navigate this new world and to, we're starting to figure out ways for the rules-based international order to fight back. I am a big fan of Robert Kagan's newish book called The Jungle Grows Back. And he uses what I think is a brilliant metaphor for the rules-based international order. He says, there was this kind of end of history moment that Børge referred to after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, when we all thought that liberal democracy in our own countries and rules-based international order around the world, that was inevitable. We were all just sort of inevitably moving towards it. And I will admit, I was guilty of thinking that. I think that was a sort of a sin of optimism, and it was okay to think that. But Kagan's point is, there is nothing inevitable or natural about liberal democracy or the rules-based international order. And that what is natural, in fact, is the jungle, and that liberal democracy and the rules-based international order is like a garden. Now, my dad is a farmer, so I very much understand how to keep your garden fertile and growing is a constant fight. It's a fight against the weeds. It's a fight against the pests. It's a fight against the animals of the forests. And I think we kind of got complacent. And we thought the garden was inevitable. And I think now is a time that we who prefer to live in a garden rather than a jungle need to start spending some time pulling up the weeds and seeding some crops for the fall. So I'll leave it there. I have some more concrete things to say, having laid out that framework, but I want to hear from my colleagues too.
Thank you, Chrystia. That was a great start of the panel, from world order to world disorder and how to handle that. And Minister Kono, Japan has now a unique opportunity to navigate and create some order in all the disorder as heading the G20 this year. We just heard this ambitious plan of Prime Minister Abe presented in the plenary. So it will be good to hear how you will use the G20 to then also pursue some of those things that can create some order in all this multi-conceptual, multipolar world.
Thank you. At G20 in Osaka this year, we will try to discuss how to achieve economic growth and economic equality at the same time. I am repeating myself over and over today, but I'm going to repeat again. Japan is also chair of a leading group on innovative financing for development this year. And using this opportunity, we wanted to raise the issue of innovative finance. Last year, we saw almost 70 million people are refugee or internally displaced, and that is the largest number since the end of the World War II. And if we are to achieve SDG goals by 2030, there's a huge funding gap. So we, and Japan with a huge government deficit, we're not going to be able to raise more foreign aid. And many G7, G20 countries are facing the similar situation. So I think it's time to think about something like international solidarity tax, putting very thin tax on, say, currency exchange, give the revenue to international organization for humanitarian assistance for refugees, internally displaced people, or those who suffered from the natural disasters. We also, I still believe that economic growth will lead to democracy in the next round. But recently, there's a big growth, but a number of the country that has democracy is not growing as fast. I still believe that real capitalism, real market economy will create a middle class who wants to have democracy in the next round. But if economic growth is led by the state capitalism, I mean, why you want to bring in election that might lead to change of the existing government, which you benefit. So I think we need to fight against the state capitalism, and we need to create economic growth, lead to democracy. And
one thing I did not mention, and I should have done in my introduction, is that adding to all the complexities that I did mention is the technological competition. The standards. You see now with G5 and etc. Are you concerned that Japan and Europe, for example, can end up in the middle of a technology war between the US and China, and there will be pressure to take side?
Well, competition is good. I mean, because of the competition, there's always innovation and growth. But what we see is technology sometimes could be manipulated, especially like if you look at digital technology and authoritarian regime. They are very compatible. Authoritarian regime used digital technology, and that ended up violating the human rights. So that's something we need to worry about. The healthy competition for technology or innovation is something we welcome. But if an authoritarian regime try to manipulate those technology, that's something we need to raise a voice.
Minister Kang, there are of course a lot of challenges out there, but one of the silver linings this year was, of course, happening on the Korean Peninsula. The dialogue between Pyongyang and, of course, Seoul, but also the historic meeting between the US President and Chairman Kim Jong-un that took place in Singapore in June, July. We know that the US President is planning to meet with Chairman Kim Jong-un again late February. We don't know where. But looking at the denuclearization, potential peace agreement between DPRK, North Korea, and South Korea, what can we expect in the year to come if you're going to look into the crystal ball?
Well, before I discuss what can we expect this year, let me just give you a vision of what this could lead to in terms of a new momentum for growth. If you look at the Korean Peninsula on the map, it juts out at the eastern end of the largest continent of the world, which is Eurasia, and into the Pacific Ocean, the largest ocean. So it looks like a natural bridge that can connect all the potential of the sea powers and the continental powers, and that should be the case. But of course, we know that that hasn't been the case for 7 decades. That disconnect that exists on the Korean Peninsula is something that has been distinctly going against the growing tides of globalization, the growing interconnectedness, and that is, of course, all because of the last remaining legacy of the Cold War. So in the meanwhile, South, the Republic of Korea, has, despite the different circumstances, has become yes, we are part of the peninsula, but we've been more like an island, basically. But we've managed to develop the economy based upon our strength in trade, our strength in exports, in shipbuilding, and so on and so forth, while the North Korea has basically remained outside. And it's like a zone frozen in some time warp, and that it has been kept that way for 7 decades. We want to change that. We want to make sure that the whole of the Korean Peninsula is prosperous and peaceful, and does act as that natural bridge between the continent and the Pacific. This military demarcation line that was put in place in 1953 at the end of the Korean War is still what separates the South and North into basically 2 hostile entities, but also has been the big barrier that has prevented any significant amount of exchanges of goods, services, and people across that divide. And as a result, the geographical potential that this peninsula should have never been seriously explored. But I think with the changes that we have, you call it the silver lining, I think we've started to make a significant shift in that direction. We've had, as you say, 3 inter-Korean summits, the first U.S.-North Korea summit, and that has meant a shift in the political dynamics on the Korean Peninsula from one of hostilities and growing tension to one of dialogue and dialogue towards a peaceful resolution of the North Korean nuclear issue, but also replacing the armistice system that is currently in place to a full-fledged peace treaty. Now, very tall order, but I think we've made the first move in that direction, making use of these historic diplomatic engagements of last year. I think with the latest visit by the North Korean envoy to Washington, D.C., I think we've back on track on the denuclearization discussions between the United States and North Korea. And now there is much expectation that the second U.S.-North Korea summit will take place. The dates have been announced as being roughly late February. The exact dates, the exact time yet to be announced.
You probably have to see if the shutdown is over too, huh?
Well, I think yes. I think the shutdown has to be taken into account. But I think the critical functions of the government still continue. I think the State Department is fully functional, and so on. But yes, it's something we have to keep in consideration. So this year we really need to make some great big strides along this road to denuclearization and lasting peace that we've managed to open up last year. The second U.S.-North Korea summit will have to deliver some concrete results, concrete advances on the denuclearization track. There is also a promise from the North Korean leader to come to the South. There have been 3 South Korean presidential visits to the North, one in 2000, one in 2007, and the third one last year, and I was part of that visit. But the North Korean leader has now promised to come to the South for his 4th meeting with President Moon. And I think if we have these summit engagements well prepared, meaning we have to somehow negotiate a successful outcome of these summits, I think we will indeed turn 2019 into another year of big steps toward denuclearization and lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. Obviously, we do all of this in very close consultation with our ally, the United States. So on the one hand, you have the South-North track moving, and then you also have the U.S.-North Korea track. And between the two of them, the South Korea-U.S. coordination is vital. Of course, we also have close consultations with Japan, China, Russia, also all having a shared goal in getting North Korea to completely denuclearize. And of course, that's not just the neighbor, it's the whole of the international community that is demanding that North Korea gives up its nuclear and missiles programs and WMD programs, in fact. So as we move along, stay tuned, and we'll see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Just a short follow-up. What we see in the world today is many proxy situations that the big movers don't have common interest, or they don't define their interest as aligned. But I guess on DPRK, North Korea, all the nations, as you mentioned, have a common interest in the denuclearization.
Yes, it's a stated goal in successive Security Council resolutions, and I think so. If any issue had united the Security Council, and we know how the Security Council in many ways is not living up to our expectations, but on this one, it has managed to maintain that unity. And in the end, I think a peaceful, nuclear-free Korean Peninsula would be in the interest of all.
Thank you. Minister Heng, Finance Minister of Singapore. We have seen a lot of new tariffs and also not so much progress in the trade area last year, but there was, in addition to the NAFTA deal, we saw quite a comprehensive free trade agreement between Singapore and the European Union being the largest market in the world. But when we saw IMF doing their presentation here in Davos on Monday with Christine Lagarde, she again underlined when they're no reducing the growth expectations for this year, they're saying that one of the main worries is also that geopolitical conflicts have negative impact on global growth.
Yes.
Are you concerned that also geopolitical geopolitics has really negative impact on trade and the slowing of the global economy moving forward?
Well, certainly. And if I could just pick up Minister Kang's point about the Korean situation. If we look back at the 20th century, I think we see great achievements as well as great tragedies. The first 70 years, we went through 2 world wars. We had the Cold War, for which huge amount of resources were devoted to militarization. In the late 50s, I think late 40s or 50s, Rand Corporation predicted that there will be 40 over nuclear powers, big and small, because of the proliferation of nuclear. So, and of course, in the Asian regions, we saw the Korean War, and today North and South Korea are still 2 separate entities with 2 completely different systems. In Southeast Asia, we have North and South Vietnam, which is now 1 country, and Vietnam is now a key member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. And ASEAN 10 as a grouping has just celebrated 50 years of its founding. And it has turned out to be a peaceful area. And if you look at what happens in Europe, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, many more members have now joined the European Union. And I think it is a much better situation, despite whatever issues there are. But I think we are in a far better situation today than it was, when major powers in Europe were contesting one another. So I think when we think about the global order in the 21st century, the key question is, what have we learned from the 20th century? What should we repeat and what should we never repeat? And I'll say certainly war is something that we should never repeat. And in order to achieve that, I think it's very important for us to have a common understanding among countries on what is it that we can do together. And let me just list a few. First on my list is peace and stability, because without peace and stability, we cannot have even life on earth, right? I think it will be a very miserable time for people. So peace and stability as a top priority. Second, we should all work together to help one another prosper, to improve to raise economic growth so that we can raise our standard of living for people, so that we can tackle the issues of jobs, so that we can harness technology far more effectively. And a very key part of that prosperity is that global free trade. I think a multilateral, rule-based free trade system has brought prosperity to the whole world in the 20th century, and particularly in the last 50 years. A very major part of that uplift in poverty has actually been made in China. So China celebrated the 40 years of Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up policy. And I've been thinking about this reform and opening up. And I would say that in many ways, all countries, when we open up, we need reform. Because when Deng Xiaoping conceived of this reform and opening up was a way to inject external pressure to stimulate reform domestically. And the more you open up, the more we have to reform. And indeed, when you think about this, the nature of economic growth must be such that as each country aspires to go onto the higher end of the value chain, the ones that are at the highest end of the value chain will need to run even faster and move out the value chain. Otherwise, nobody is content to be at the bottom end of a value chain. I've met colleagues from developing countries that were exporting commodities, and they felt that this is not fair because we produce all the great commodities, but the commodities are exported, refined, manufactured into very expensive products and sold back to us at many times the prices and sold to the world at many times the prices. But they are not able to do that partly because the growth is not there and the technology is not there and the marketing is not there. So for us to think about how the new value chain needs to be structured and how we need to restructure our economy together so that we can all move out the value chain and improve lives for people will be a key part of this work. And there I think technology will be a key enabler of this. And the third goal that I was set for the global community is that we should take care to improve the quality of life of our people and take care of the environment. And in that regard, I think the global community needs to come together to address a number of challenges to protect our global commons. Because whichever part of the world we live in, we are going to be affected by climate change. And for an island nation like Singapore, climate change is an existential threat. If sea level rises the way that's predicted, we'll no longer be there. And so with many other island nations, the safest country may be Nepal because, the Himalayas is there. But I think we should really take a much more science-based approach and look at the effect of climate change and look at the effect of how we can all act together to mitigate our carbon footprint. And so that's the first. And two, I think we should all work together to safeguard ourselves against global pandemics. In the Asian region, we had a terrible episode of SARS. And fortunately, SARS was contained, but many lives were lost in the process. And SARS demonstrated essentially how global a pandemic can be. What originated in one part of the world quickly spread to the other parts of the world, and the global economy came to a grinding halt. I recall how tourism, for instance, froze because of that. We should work together to protect the global financial system. I was at the Monetary Authority of Singapore, our central bank, when the global financial crisis happened. And when I looked out of my office, my goodness, it used to be a vibrant container port, and there were no containers around. It was empty because trade froze. And I think we need to think about, what can we do to make sure that we do not have global crises of that nature that set back many, many countries and really, I would say, affected the lives of millions of people around the world, both in the countries where this crisis happened as well as in countries, and wiped out a lot of savings of people. So I think safeguarding our global commons, and of course, one other very major threat that we have to look at is extremism in its various forms. I think it's very sad to see, how even in Christmas markets and all that, you see innocent people being killed. And I think promoting better understanding and acting against extremists, and of course, nuclear non-proliferation. I think today, at least, we have a fair balance of power among the nuclear states, and that non-proliferation is taking off, is being held. And it's important for us to maintain that. And you mentioned about the issue of inequality. So indeed, I think as we think of growing the economy, and as we think about the greater use of technology, you see an increasing difference in income distribution, both across countries as well as within countries. So it's important for us to work on that. One final point that I would like to make is that the WEF has a global situation space that was below, and then they used the computer graphics to illustrate the progress that we have made. And I was very struck by the series of computer graphics showing how income across the whole world have generally improved quite significantly over the last centuries, how poverty has been reduced significantly, illiteracy has come down significantly, and major diseases and the quality of healthcare have improved. So I hope that WEF consider putting this out so that all of us can share with the young people in our countries the importance of working together is looking at how the world progresses together. But it is a very beautiful set of graphics. And I would like to issue a challenge for all of us to say that if we were to meet 100 years later, what would that graphic show? Would we, what are the goals that we are seeking? And are we able to tell, our grandchildren and great-grandchildren 100 years from now that together we have worked towards a better world order?
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. I will come back with some questions later on inclusive growth, internalizing externalities, and the platform economy,
yes.
and also this solidarity tax that was mentioned by the Japanese Foreign Minister. But I think we need now to move to the US, still the largest economy in the world, around 20% of global GDP, 5% of the global population, 45% of the global military power is still with the US. And David Gergen has worked for Democratic and Republican administrations. And I was thinking when Chrystia spoke about, we are maybe back in more of a state of globally with the rules of the jungle, and we have to cope with a situation where the rules-based world is different, but we have to make the best out of it. We have to also train ourselves to have good results in that sense. So my question, David, to you would be art of the possible in DC today, because we know the situation in the House, we know the situation in the Senate, and we know which administration we have. Is it possible to deliver positive outcomes from DC these days?
Possible. I wouldn't go beyond. Let me make it clear up front that I'm not quite sure why I was asked, but I'm not here representing the Trump administration or its views. Indeed, if the president were listening, and I'm sure we would be seeing very shortly an explosive set of tweets that would denounce us all. Ms. Freeland opened, I thought, with a very interesting metaphor about the jungle coming back. And she basically said, we need to cultivate a garden out of the jungle. And I was reminded, as you spoke, of a book that Dean Acheson, former Secretary of State in America, wrote called Present at the Creation, which was after he had served with other wise men with President Truman to build the architecture that came out of the Second World War that had served us so well for so long that needs to be upgraded. But nonetheless, that architecture lasted longer than any other that one might have imagined. And in his book, Dean Acheson talks about the cultivation of a garden. It was a metaphor that he liked and saw that as a way of thinking about American foreign policy. And basically, in the 70 years since, the United States has, I think, embraced that notion of cultivating a garden. And we haven't always succeeded. We've made many mistakes. But I think that the aspirations were positive. And now we have something of this real anomaly, and that is we, for the first time, our voters have voted into office someone who wants to burn down the jungle. And that is a very different sensibility. And I do think we have to, we can talk about what's coming in the next couple of years, but I would like to appeal to you here at Davos and those who come in Davos in the next couple of years. It does seem to me that there are a couple of things that are needed. One is that there is going to come a day when President Trump is gone. Now, we don't know if that's going to be 2 years from now, it may be even earlier, or it will be 6 years from now. But there's going to come a time when there's going to be a new administration. And it would be really helpful to begin preparing for that day, because remember that he may leave the scene, but the discontented voters who voted him in will still be there. And many of their issues will still be there. It's worth remembering we've just had the longest bull run in our stock market in history. We've had some good economic times. Incomes have gone up in a number of countries, and yet the discontent is deep, and it's threatening our democracies. And there's something that's not working here that we need to figure out, because it's going to be so important when the United States tries to re-enter the stage. How is that done? How do we bring a healing to make that transition work? I think the next president, frankly, is going to inherit a deeply polarized nation. And how that next president can then have the strength to build a consensus and rejoin Paris or to rejoin the Iranian agreement. How is that all going to work out? I don't think any of us knows that, but the degree to which that conversation can begin, I think would help a great deal when we conclude the conversation. I would also say that it's very apparent as we talk about architecture here and architecture 4.0, global architecture, globalism 4.0, and we talk again and again about a new architecture, when at the very time so many peoples and so many countries reject the architecture that we've had, that we have to build a new architecture that's not only about global institutions, but an architecture that addresses some of these underlying problems so that democracy is not under siege. We cannot go on with democracies weakened. What Macron is facing, what they're facing in Brexit, what Merkel has been facing, and you can go on through the list, and what the United States is facing. We can't go on with that, these weakened democracies, and expect to do big things on the international stage. It is not going to be possible to embrace the kind of robust climate change approach that so many here in this room want if our leaders don't have the capacity to build a consensus at home. You know, the success of foreign policy so often depends on the capacity of the person who's leading the country to look behind his shoulder and see, or her behind her shoulder and see, I've got the people with me and I can negotiate from strength, not from weakness. And so a lot of this then goes to, in my judgment, we don't have the answers. We're searching for answers, but I think all of us ought to be searching for answers, especially in our democracies, about how do we have an architecture that not only works within the global system, but does work at home and ends this discontent and strengthens the fibers of democracy.
Thank you, David. We're also seeing, though, some progress in the U.S. now because the unemployment rate is falling to the lowest since early 90s, and we're seeing some unskilled workers' salaries increasing for the first time in decades.
Yep. But how long is that going to last? We're at 3% growth, and all the forecasts now, especially with the shutdown, you know, IMF and others have come out with forecasts that see growth going down. That is bad news for the workers, and it is bad news, obviously, for the president.
And the president is, as most presidents, probably also focused on a re-election.
Is there anything else they're focused on?
I'm just a moderator. The shutdown can now have a negative impact on growth. So there is probably now a lot of pressure to solve this. So what do you expect, short version of that, on the shutdown piece? And secondly, a bigger question, later in January, Li He, the vice premier of China, is expected in D.C. To discuss trade. And we are now seeing the lowest growth in China in decades. And it is affecting also the world because we are part of the same economy. You think that the administration will strike a deal with China, at least short term, as was done with NAFTA, because of concerns about slowing global growth? And if this hits in before the election, this can be bad for re-election?
Well, let's take it in turn. On the shutdown, internally in the White House, the president is being told that every week of the shutdown reduces the anticipated growth of the economy by 0.1%. So we're now basically around 5 weeks. That's 0.5% shaving off. Now, we don't know if that for sure, but when you're already looking at 2.6, 2.7, a 0.5 drop is very significant. Now, in turn, that is causing more and more pain in the administration, and it's beginning to be painful to the Democrats. So I do think that with a president whose eye has been continuously on the re-election question, that it's going to be in his extreme interest to get this solved sooner rather than later, to end this sooner rather than later. And he's got to, I think the question is, can you find a way out that both sides can see as face-saving? And I think there are solutions, but it's going to take each side to come off their high horse to get there. And I worry this same pattern of essentially, threatening, the president threatened, serious damage to our system in order to get his wall. We're seeing the same pattern emerge with regard to China, the relationship with China. It's the same, take some issue, a real threat, create a crisis. He thinks he gains leverage, then leverage into the talks, and then come to the out, and then get a better outcome. That's his sort of modus operandi. And it has worked for him sometimes in business. It does not work well in governing. And so it's had a mixed record in governing. But I do think that both sides are going to be looking for a way out now. It's pretty apparent that they need it, and I would assume they'd get there in 2 or 3 weeks. But the same going to the China question, you all know this better than I especially think with this group of foreign ministers would know where this is likely to come out. I was struck to learn today that the talks that were scheduled for next week, not with the top people, but one level down, that the people were coming to Washington from China to lay the groundwork for the major talks that were going to occur in a couple of weeks, that those meetings have been canceled by the United States. And that sent a signal that we're not so far along, especially on structural aspects of these talks, as we thought we might be, and I think it cast doubt. The lead story in the New York Times today, New York Times, is the growing pessimism about where this is coming out. So I don't have any privy information. I did think, again, that for both sides, both the Chinese and the Americans, there was a strong self-interest in having a good outcome in these talks. And so I'd been assuming that they would end happily, but it looks to me like we're back into an period of great uncertainty.
Thank you, David. Minister Heng, we usually turn to Singapore to decipher and understand China, but you also have a good knowledge of the U.S. Singapore may be the largest FDI investor in China, but also in the ASEAN. Listening now to what David said, slowing global growth, what is your reading? Do you think there will be an agreement between the U.S. And China? Is the Chinese leadership also willing to address those topics that are raised from the U.S., intellectual property, issues about the state-owned enterprises? And as you said in your intervention, the first one, if you open up, you have to reform. And maybe these were reforms that the Chinese leadership was planning anyway. We would love to hear your deciphering.
Well, I think it's going to be, first and foremost, I hope that there will be some agreement between China and the US, because the stakes are very high, not just between the two countries, but also for all the rest of us. Because we are already seeing the effect of the trade tension on the global growth. The IMF has cut global growth forecasts. So it's not only between China and the US, but the global supply chain is so integrated. I spoke to a number of multinational CEOs last evening, and they were very concerned because they were concerned that they made the same point that the global supply chain is so integrated that any sort of change, any sort of disruption is going to bring very severe disruption to the entire global chain. That's first. Two, we're beginning to see already a shift in the supply chain. And in the short run, I think some neighboring countries are benefiting. So for instance, we're beginning to see, partly as a result of high wages in China, rising wages in China, partly as a result of this trade tension, there was already a movement of the supply chain into Vietnam, Cambodia, and so on, all the countries if we move south. So I think there will be a reconfiguration of the global supply chain in some ways, but I hope that we can do it in a steady way. But The Economist had a very interesting article, very front-page article a few weeks back that talked not about the trade deficit alone, but chip war. That was the title of it. It's a chip war, it's a technology war, it's interesting that in your blurb for the WEF, it talks about strategic competition. Because it's not just about trade, it's about technology, about technological superiority. It is about the governance model. What will bring a better quality of life to people? Now, in that regard, almost more than 30 years ago, our founding Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, spoke in various interviews very extensively about this China-US relationship. That he predicted more than 30 years ago that as the Chinese economy rises and increases its weight in the global economy, there will be increasing tensions between China and the US. But the strategic competition that will take place is one thing. It is important for us to ensure that it does not result in a strategic conflict, because that will be quite a major problem for all of us. And I hope that we can reach some understanding on that issue. I was at a session earlier on where somebody said, imagine all of us are on the plane and you have the pilot and co-pilots and they are now fighting with one another. And I thought it was an interesting metaphor. But at the same time, I think going beyond that metaphor, I hope that beyond just having two pilots, that we also have some autopilot that the rest of us can work on. And that is, and therefore, David's earlier point about the post-World War II global architecture and the institutions have been set up. The United Nations, the World Bank, IMF, the Bretton Woods Agreement, the trade and the IMF. I think they are not perfect. Things have changed and we need to change. So I hope that we continue to do that. Second, I hope that the US and China can reach some agreement on what that pilot and co-pilot's roles are going to be, while the rest of us maybe have have some safety net. And finally, I think what David mentioned about the discontent, I think it is an issue that all of us will have to deal with, because the rising inequality, the rising problems across nations, within nations, and the sense that globalization has not benefited us. My life has not become better, because the benefits of globalization are very diffuse and is widely spread. None of us remember that I got a cheaper product because of globalization, but some of us will remember that I lost my job because of globalization. And in that regard, I would just add one more item, that not only do we need to rethink our global governance system for these institutions, but also governance system within our own countries. Now, in some places, the way to get elected every 3 or 5 years is to safeguard your base. And the more extreme the base is, the more you have to appeal to extreme positions in order to secure an election. And the outcome is that whoever gets elected now has the hard job of satisfying their base and therefore taking very extreme policies. And again, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew predicted many years ago that sometimes elections are like a bidding contest. The highest bidder wins, but the highest bidder now ends up with a bid that he cannot fulfill because it means massive amounts of spending. And massive amounts of spending means the way to do it is to undertake big debt, and then the debt is passed on to future generation. So I think we do have a responsibility to our future generation to make sure that we have enough safeguards within our system to guard against such extremes.
Thank you, Minister. I think we have been reminded that we're all on the same flight or in the same boat, but not necessarily acting accordingly.
Yes.
And I think we also saw during the economic crisis in 2008 that there was no decoupling. In Europe, we said, oh, this is a subprime crisis in the US. And there was a little bit of hubris that lasted 2 months, and then the crisis was worse here. This, I think we will also realize again. But one of the main worries, Chrystia, and this is coming back to your initial thinking about how are we going to cope in a world disorder. We have to make the best out of it. If there is a new crisis, because the death level is no higher than it was in 2007, 250 trillion US dollars, 250% of the global GDP. We have also all other challenges. But what made it happen? What was positive in 2008? At least we came together and we agreed on very unorthodox policies, fiscal and monetary. If there is a new crisis, would that be possible, or would the pilots continue to fight? And you said you had some ideas on how we should act in this more disorderly world.
Okay, well, those are easy questions.
You have 2 minutes.
For 2 minutes, yeah. Thank you, Børge. So, look, if there is a new crisis, and by the way, there will inevitably be a new crisis.
Yes.
You know, the state of economies and the state of the global economy is such that there always are crises. So our base case scenario planning should be assuming there will be a bad year and having, some plans for how we're going to deal with it. What can we do to be ready? I think the first thing is something that a lot of colleagues have mentioned, which is I would sort of borrow a line from Tip O'Neill, who used to say all politics is local. And I would say all geopolitics is ultimately domestic. And the first job of all of us is to have our own domestic house in order. If we want to be fighters for the rules-based international order, if we want to work on that international garden, we can only do it from a position of strength at home. We have a finance minister here, so of course our own domestic balance sheets need to be good. Canada has the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7, and that's something we look at very closely. But I think we also need to be sure that our citizens feel like the global economy is working for them. Right. And it's not just a question of perception. I think a mistake we sometimes make, especially in, the high altitude esoteric climbs of Davos, is to say, oh, it's just about perception. Actually, everything is fantastic for the middle classes in our countries. It's not fantastic for everybody. People are really good at knowing how their pocketbooks are and about their domestic budget. And I think we have to be frank with ourselves that especially, I would say, sort of starting in the 70s, the way global capitalism has grown has been really bad for some people in the middle class in Western industrialized countries. And we need to fix that, because if we don't, then politicians will find ways of tapping into that rage. And the easiest way to channel that legitimate anger is to say, it is the fault of people who don't look like you in your own country, it's the fault of immigrants, or it is the fault of those bad foreigners who are cheating us on trade. And, we've seen this story before. We saw it in the 1920s and in the 1930s. What can we do about it? Børge, I see you're getting anxious. So super quickly, I would say we just need to do it. And we need to actually be acting together and find ways to keep multilateralism going. And I think the story is actually there. You can say the glass is half empty, but there are lots of ways in which the glass is full. And I would actually say trade is one of them. We have concluded the CPTPP.
Yes.
We, members of the Asia Pacific, we're very proud of that. Canada now has a trade deal with Europe. Japan does. Singapore does. This is really significant. Canada, we managed to keep our trade deal with the United States. So you can move forward. It's harder maybe than it used to be. We have a trade deal with South Korea. We're very happy about that too. And then I think we need to find ways. I would use a WTO parallel. At the WTO, as people have found, moving forward on the mega rounds is getting harder. I think we kind of got stuck at Doha. There is a movement of saying, let's do some plurilateral deals. Let's find some ad hoc groupings around specific issues we can agree on, keep them open to others. And I think more broadly in foreign policy, we need to be starting to do that. We're doing that in the Americas with the Lima Group, which is a group of like-minded countries working on Venezuela. And there are many other examples where we just need to say, okay, it's not as easy as we thought it was going to be in 1989, but we need to find ways of working together.
Thank you. Minister Kono, you're the chief gardener this year, as with the presidency of the G20. So, what is the chief gardener planning? We heard some of the ideas, but
Well, we talked about President Trump. In a way, he's a great politician because he's trying to keep what he promised in the election. A lot of politicians promise something, but once he's elected, he forget about it. But President Trump meticulously tried to fill out the promise. I don't know what he promised was good or bad, but right now with the recent technology, it gives each individual power to express himself, herself. But when it comes to politics, it's still indirect politics. You choose somebody to represent you in the parliament, and they would decide. With recent technology, probably we can think of more way of direct politics. We can probably introduce new way to make decisions, not through indirect representation in the parliament, but we can probably ask more directly to each voters what they think, and they have to be responsible for the consequences. That's something that there's a mismatch. You can talk about it, but you cannot have power to make decisions for yourself. I think we have to trust the voters. We have to give power to make decisions, and you have to be responsible for what you have decided. And that's something we need to do to overcome this discontent.
arigato. Minister Kang, you will have the opportunity to sum up.
Well, so I think the perception and facts, how real is real? It's as real as people perceive it to be real. Facts are facts, and it's very important that we base policy on facts, but people are thinkers. They think based upon the facts. But I think the danger of the world today is that we've lost sight of the facts. And your fact is as good as... There's so much fakeness out there. And I think as leaders, whether it's domestically or internationally, I think the primary responsibility of leaders anywhere is to make the point that facts are important. There's an inspiring book called Factfulness by Hans Rosling. It's hugely inspiring, and that's good. But that's people are more driven by perception based upon those facts than the facts themselves. So I think we constantly need to drive home the message that policies cannot be based upon anything other than fact. But it's hard. As Mr. Kono says, when there's so much online, when you don't know what's fact or not, but it's really incumbent upon the leaders ourselves to really dig at what is the fact and what should be driving our policies. So let me end it there.
Thank you so much. Let's also then hope that the facts are a pretty stubborn thing.
Yes.
In this respect. It has been a huge privilege for me to moderate this session. I learned a lot, very thoughtful contributions. I hope that the participants do feel the same. So we'll listen to the applause. Thank you.